By 1968, capitalism had been booming for 2 decades. There was full employment. Teenage workers with disposable income fueled an explosion of culture. There were some philosophers who wrote off the working class, claiming that the possibility of rebellion had gone, that workers who had televisions and washing machines and decent wages wouldn't fight back. But capitalism rests on oppression and war, as well as exploitation of workers, and the victims of oppression and war were going to fight back. The events of May 1968 in Paris were a profound shock to General de Gaulle's 10-year presidency. Factory and university occupations led to a near revolution. Paris Police Chief Maurice Urumeau was asked if revolution was possible in 1968 in France. He said, "The police could possibly disperse a demonstration, overturn 10 or 20 barricades, but it could not clear 100 or 500 factories, workshops, department stores, banks and train stations." Students in Nanterre in Paris had a series of teach-ins, occupations and protests which led to clashes with police. They protested against the Vietnam War and for the right to share dorms. The student protests escalated when the dean closed the college. Students took to the streets of the left bank of Paris. They were joined by young workers. This culminated on the 10th of May in what was called the Night of the Barricades. But what turned protests by groups of student anarchists and Trotskyists into a near workers' revolution? Well, one factor was the state's violent response. 367 people were hospitalised, 468 were arrested. The police used tear gas and beatings. Paris watched on as the French state brutalised its youth. The French state had always used violence against opposition movements. In 1961, 200 protesting Algerians had been murdered by the police. There was huge resentment for the police in working class areas. There was also dozens of protests in the weeks leading up to May, protests by farmers, by students and by unions. The May events were a result of a convergence of many social movements. In response to the state repression, the unions called a general strike on May 13, 1968. This escalated the movement, but the union leaders played a contradictory role. By calling a general strike, they escalated the movement and legitimised it in the minds of many workers. But the union bureaucrats also moved to try and exclude the far left. Protests spread nationwide, soon to be accompanied by workers' strikes. Renault workers occupied their factory on the 15th of May. The occupations were driven by rank-and-file workers who were making links with the radical students. The Sud Aviation plant in Nantes was occupied after a socialist strike committee member suggested escalating beyond the strike to occupation. 10 million workers were soon on strike, with occupations spreading across the country. President de Gaulle warned of civil war, and on the 29th of May he fled to a French airbase in Germany. This near revolution came to an end because the radicals hadn't as much weight in the working class as the union leaders and the conservative French Communist Party. When the movement dipped, the police violently attacked striking workers. For a few weeks in 1968, France had stood on the brink of popular revolution. Workers had taken over the workplaces. The president had fled. So much for those French philosophers who had written the workers off. The Vietnam War had been the cause of some of the early French student protests, and 1968 saw the US military suffer a huge blow during what was called the Tet Offensive. In the 1950s, American workers were told that they lived the American dream. They were told that the bitter class conflicts of the 1930s were a distant memory. Of course, African Americans and victims of racism were excluded from this American dream. The war and the demand for civil rights would see an explosion of struggle in the USA in the 1960s. The civil rights protests began with the bus boycott of 1955 to 57, but the movement grew in the 60s with the counter-protests and sit-ins by young black people who refused to leave white-only counters in restaurants. By 1963, 200,000 people had marched to Washington to hear Martin Luther King give his "I Have a Dream" speech. Networks of students who organised for civil rights also began to protest against the Vietnam War. They were soon joined by people from all walks of life and returning soldiers. As anti-war protests grew, so did the anti-racist movement. 100 US cities saw riots by impoverished black people in 1967. By March 1968, Martin Luther King went to Memphis to support a sanitation workers' strike. He was assassinated one day after his "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. 20,000 people marched through the streets of Memphis in response, holding placards saying "Honor King, end racism." 150,000 marched at his funeral. There were riots across the USA in protest against the assassination. The government was forced by this people power uprising to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1968. By the start of 1968, 15,000 US troops had died in Vietnam. 40,000 new people were drafted every month to fight in a brutal war. The Vietnamese resistance grew, culminating in the Tet Offensive. In 1968, 10,000 people protested outside the Democratic Conference in Chicago, but they faced brutal suppression by the cops. Resistance by the Vietnamese people, coupled with a growing anti-war sentiment at home, eventually ended the US presence in Vietnam. But it wasn't just in the West that revolution erupted. The Prague Spring showed an alternative to Stalinism. As pictures of the police beating protesters outside the Democratic Conference in Chicago were being broadcast, TV stations also broadcast the sight of Russian tanks entering Czechoslovakia. At the start of 1968, some of the bureaucrats running Czechoslovakia wanted reforms in order to boost a failing economy. But hardliners didn't want any change. This split in the ruling class opened up room for debate in the press, the colleges, and in the workplaces. Factory workers started to protest, demanding real workplace democracy and genuine socialism. By June, a wave of strikes began. The reforming wing of the ruling class were powerless to stop the tide of revolt that they had accidentally unleashed. For Russia, the Prague Spring was a threat. Real socialism, with working class people taking hold of the factories, was an example that they had to crush. They labelled the workers as counter-revolutionaries and threatened to invade, which they did on August 20th. The Russians arrested the government and shot 100 civilians. Even in the face of Russian tanks, radical radio and TV channels continued. Young workers went out and argued with the Russian soldiers. There was a 3-day strike in November, but the protests began to dwindle as they focused on supporting the reform wing of the bureaucracy against the hardliners. Ireland wasn't immune to the wave of radicalism in 1968. In the south, workers took part in a massive strike wave. Over 1.5 million strike days were lost. But it was in the north that the fire of rebellion was most intense. The north had been ruled with an iron fist for decades. Orange politicians had denied the Catholic minority their rights to housing, votes were gerrymandered, and the cops and special police powers meant that any opposition was beaten down. The economy of the north had been in decline, so when Captain Terence O'Neill was elected Prime Minister, he was set the task of reforming the economy. This led to expectations among the Catholic population that things would change. They were wrong. Activists in Derry, like socialist Eamon McCann, organised a Derry Housing Action Committee, taking inspiration from the civil rights movements in the USA. Their first protest was small, pushing a caravan into a road, but soon they organised protest marches. On the 5th of October 1968, the first civil rights march took place in Derry. The protest was beaten off the streets. Another march was called by socialists, republicans and students who had formed a new group called People's Democracy. This 4-day march, which wanted to imitate Martin Luther King's march from Selma to Montgomery, was beaten by thugs and followers of Ian Paisley. The protests escalated, as did the police repression. The British government sent troops into the north in August 1969. They claimed they were there to protect the Catholics, but in reality, the British state wanted to prop up Unionist rule. The mass movement was brutally repressed by both the police and the army, leading to an armed resistance. But it was mass resistance and people power that could have shook the northern state and also won over the Protestant poor. In the south, the protest movements for housing, against church domination, and the strikes by workers escalated. But the main beneficiary of this growing radicalism was the Labour Party. The Labour Party had thousands of branches. They grew and recruited. They promised the 70s would be socialist. But by 1973, they had abandoned all their pretense at socialism and were in coalition with the conservative Fine Gael. The resulting demoralisation amongst working class people led workers to turn back to the right-wing Fianna Fáil. 1968 was a year of terrible suffering, but it was also a year of revolution and of great hope. A new world seemed possible. 50 years on, we should take inspiration from the fire last time. We should learn from the 1960s so that we can light the fire of struggle once again.